Nós somos os Quadrinheiros, eu sou o Nerd Bully, eu vou entrevistar hoje o professor Ian Gordon. Ele é professor na Universidade de Singapura, tem um PhD em História e é especialista em quadrinhos. So, hi professor.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Good, thank you.
All right. So, why study comics?
It's a great question. Comics are a medium that have been around for well over a couple of hundred years in various forms. They've developed over time. They've taken the form of comic strips in many countries. Some of those are distinctive to those countries in different ways and forms. And also comic books have developed with American-style comic books, and then, of course, the different styles in Japan, in the Franco-Belgian market, and different in the United Kingdom, just to mention a few. There are comic books all over the world of different types and forms, and they're a way of understanding different cultures and a whole set of issues about different cultures. The different sorts of comics they have help us understand the differences between cultures. And then if we look at something like superhero comics, which is something I've been doing lately, it lets us understand something about American culture, where these heroes developed and why they developed in the ways that they did and how they continue to exist. And it lets us look at a number of issues that go from the kind of cultural norms of the country through to various ways of doing business in that country.
Right. There are people who say there are different types among comics, mangás, bande dessinée, gibi. Do you believe there are enough difference from such different concepts, or these are merely an unjustified affectation? After all, it's comics anyway.
I think both are true. They're comics anyway, and they are quite different. Comics in a sense, if we get obsessed about defining what a comic is, then we can define them in certain ways, but then we'll keep finding exceptions to that rule, because when we look at something that doesn't fit the rule, it still looks like a comic to us. So, for instance, I'd say that comics are a particular form of communication that involve both visual elements and textual elements. Some folks like to take us back to cave drawings and hieroglyphics and the Bayeux Tapestry, but I say, well, yes, those are forms of communication that involve visual and sometimes textual elements, but they're not comics. They're things that predate comics. If you look at some early things like broadsheets that have panels and tell stories moving between panels, those, well, they're more like comics because of the ways in which they're organized. So I am not the sort that wants to get obsessed by defining this, that, or the other as a comic or not a comic. I think there are very distinctive things about manga that make them different from American comic books, for instance, but those American comic books in recent years have borrowed more and more things from manga. Sometimes it's just the form that's different. Inside, things can look very, very similar.
Yeah. Do you read comics? What kind of comics do you read?
Well, these days I tend to mostly read comics because I'm trying to do some academic work on them. So I've read a lot of Superman. Very early Superman, I've read everything certainly from 38 to 45, and I've read after that an enormous amount of Superman. But as a kid, I read Batman was probably my first favorite superhero, and then of course I read mostly Marvel comics with only a few DC comics here and there. I read underground comics. I read a lot of underground comics. And then, once the comic art form in America took different forms, what's often called graphic novels, I read those kind of things like Mouse and so on. I also read, as a kid, I read British comics like Beano and Eagle and some other ones like Wiz and I can't remember the titles of them all. But some of those had a mixture of reprinting American comics like Spider-Man and English comics of the sort that you'd see in Beano. So I read an enormous variety of comics over the years. These days, I tend just to read things that I'm working on. I'm working on things on comic strips at the moment, so I'm reading comic strips at the moment. And I've read a lot of comic strips as well.
Sure. You are about to release a book about Superman, but you said you never liked the character. So why bother to write a book about it?
Okay. Hopefully I'm about to release a book of Superman. It's finished, and I'm talking with a publisher at the moment. I never particularly liked Superman comic books, but I used to, I watched the Adventures of Superman TV show that was made in the 50s. I watched it a bit later than the 50s. And the Superman movies, and I watched a lot of the various Superman television shows in more recent years, like Lois and Clark and Smallville. But the character was never as interesting to me as Batman. I mean, Superman's sort of like his father shot him off into space and he came to a place and he had powers, and so he had to do something, right? But Batman, wow, Batman's parents get killed in front of him, and instead of going crazy mad, well, he does go crazy mad. He's obsessed, but he's obsessed with training himself to basically destroy all criminals. And I find that kind of human obsession a bit more interesting than a guy who just kind of arrives and has all these incredible powers. Batman had to work at it. Superman kind of got it easy. It's not that I particularly dislike Superman. It's just I don't find the character as interesting as a reader. But as an academic trying to understand American culture, I think Superman is infinitely fascinating. Firstly, that as a reader, a character I find pretty boring could have such a great impact, could become an icon of America. How did that happen? That the character can retain its popularity even after all these bad movies like Return of Superman and Man of Steel. You still see people all over the world wearing Superman logo T-shirts and baseball caps everywhere. Everywhere I've gone, there they are wearing Superman stuff. So why is that? That's what makes Superman fascinating to me, even though as a reader I'm not that interested in the character.
Well, I don't want to give you any spoiler of your book, but why do you think that happens?
I think it happens for a number of reasons. Firstly, Superman was the first superhero. Secondly, a lot of people watched Superman in various forms when they were younger. So people who saw the 78 movie when they were 10 years old probably have some kind of connection. The various TV shows that have come since have created audiences who are engaged with the character because they like the actors that played them, they enjoyed the stories, because it's reached a point where, hey, it's Superman. It's kind of like, you may not like American things, but hey, it's Coca-Cola. And you may not even drink it, but it's Coca-Cola, and somehow that's become cool. So what I try to do is talk a bit about the ways in which Superman's become this iconic figure. And it's not something so easily expressed. It takes, I'm selling my book. You need to read the book when it comes out. But some of it's nostalgia, and some of it's because he represents America. He represents, in some ways, some of the bad things about America, but he represents some of the good things about America. He fights for truth and justice, right? Who doesn't want truth and justice in the world? He also fights for the American way, and sometimes maybe we, all the rest of us in the world, don't want the American way, but truth and justice, well, we like that idea.
Great. You wrote an article that explored a lot about nostalgia and how Superman evokes a certain type of nostalgia because although he is the same, he changes as the times goes by. He's the same, but he changes. It's often common among fans saying that the Superman of their time, of their youth, are better than the Superman that exists now. So Superman becomes a kind of weapon between a clash of generations. How do you see those things?
Well, it possibly becomes that, but most of the time when the producers of Superman in his various forms offer us a new version, like in Smallville, they try to incorporate elements of an earlier version. Sometimes that's because, most of the time, it's because they want the audience for the earlier version to come and look at this new version. And sometimes it's done in a playful way because they want the newer audience to go, oh, that's from that earlier version. Oh, that's kind of funny. So they have guest stars or they use expressions. So, for instance, in Smallville, at one stage, Clark Kent reads Nietzsche's Man or Superman, and Lana Lang asks him, well, what are you, man or Superman? He's not yet Superman. He's going through the 10 seasons of Smallville. He's becoming Superman. But it sort of reminds us of where that phrase comes from and that that's part of his connection. And at another stage in Smallville, Clark Kent thinks of running for student government on a slogan of maybe he's the man of tomorrow, which is another phrase from the history of Superman. So the producers put those things in there for people to spot because it helps create an attachment and an engagement with the series. Even if you didn't see the original versions, it's like, oh yeah, I recognize that. And that gives you, oh yeah, I know lots about Superman, so yeah, I love this show. So nostalgia is used to market, not just to people who remember that version and experienced it and nostalgic for it, but for other people to give them a sense of, oh, I know a lot about Superman. It makes me feel good that I know these sort of things and I can spot them when they do them in the show. And it creates conversations about the show.
Right. So talking about fans, you seem to travel a lot. And on those trips, are you able to notice a difference from country to country, especially among the fans? Or fans, there are fans anyway in any country. There are different types of fans in different types of countries.
I don't know a lot of fans in a lot of different countries. I know a lot of academics in different countries who study comics. And just observation by walking around in different countries, the number of people that you see wearing superhero insignias like Batman or Superman, it's always kind of astounding to me. I remember being in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, which is quite close to where I live, and seeing a family of 4 all wearing the same Superman t-shirt. And before I could get a photo, they'd walk past where I was having lunch. But it reminded me that, that Superman has this universality about him that's beyond comic books. You can buy Superman comic books in Malaysia, I'm sure. I know there are comic book shops, but there's a DC shop in a major shopping mall, and all it sells is t-shirts, action figures, and maybe a 1 or 2 copies of a bound things like Superman Archives, but it basically doesn't sell comic books. So Superman, just when I travel, I realize Superman is much more than comic books, and that it's consumed around the world. And one of the things that people seem to, the way they express that is by wearing Superman t-shirts. And that's probably the most common thing I see around the world, is this universality of Superman. He's such a broad appeal to folks. I think I've seen somebody wearing some sort of Superman insignia in every country I've ever been in.
Great. So to finish, what question you usually ask about comics? What's the most common question, and what's the question that you've been never asked for but you think it's essential?
Generally, people ask about why is this character so popular, why is that character so popular? And the answer to that is generally because they're being told in stories that appeal to people. They've been told so often that they've become icons of the culture, and people share them with their kids, and that just increases their popularity. It's more complex than that, but the arguments that one would make in answer to that question revolve around they're popular because they've been popular for so long, and their initial popularity, why they were that belongs to a certain time and place, and now they've become much more than that. Generally, I think we don't talk enough about the economics of comics, the ways in which they're produced in certain ways. We think of, there are DC comics, but we don't. When we talk about it, if we talk about the artists and the writers of them, we talk about them as Neil Gaiman, the big star, or Neil Adams, or earlier Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby, or Jerry Siegel, and we single out authors and artists as these essential figures, these individuals, but really, comics are a part of larger corporations that control these, and many hands contribute to creating different superheroes and different incarnations of them, and the versions through which we know them. So many people will know the phrase truth, justice, and the American way, but they won't know who wrote it, because it wasn't Jerry Siegel. And I think that's important, that we think about how these characters are not just the creation of individuals. As important as it is to recognize those individuals' roles and the people who created the characters, and that they deserve to be rewarded financially, we do need to think about some of these bigger issues, especially when so many of us now see these comic superheroes in other medium like film and television, that we need to think about these bigger issues of how these were produced and come to us.
All right, Professor. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you.
Isso aí, esses foram os quadrinhos do professor Ian Gordon.